Welcome to the Justice Dialogues, an initiative of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I'm Chandra Crane, the Mixed Ministry Coordinator with the Multi-Ethnic Initiatives Department. For this episode, I have a conversation with two professors and colleagues from my time in campus ministry at Emory University. Dr. Andra Gillespie is the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference and a political science professor at Emory, and helped start their faculty fellowship. Dr. Kyle Beardsley is the Deputy Director of the Triangle Institute of Security Studies and a political science professor at Duke University. He also helped start the Emory Faculty Fellowship during his time there. In our dialogue, we discuss the importance of individual repentance and the necessity of structural change, healthy spiritual disciplines, speaking the truth firmly and in love, and how mutual respect is a critical part of pursuing justice. One of the most valuable aspects of academia is the ability to interact, challenge, and expand our experience of weighty and complex topics. Dialogue leads to growth. This season of the Justice Dialogues brings that strength to conversations on the integration of justice, faith, and practice in the academy. Growing in our engagement with justice is a lifelong journey. Thank you for joining us for this part of it. We will not always agree with everything we hear, but we can personally benefit, and it benefits the Church Universal when we have these conversations. So I'm so excited to have a conversation with both of you today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective as political scientists, as colleagues in the field of political science, and as people who care very deeply about justice, how that is playing out in your classrooms, in your institutes, in your day-to-day life. So to start us off, Andra, would you share with us, is there an event or two, something that catalyzed your thoughts about justice? Obviously, as a Black woman in America, that is something you've been thinking about from a young age. But in terms of being a political scientist, can you share where you might have started integrating those questions of faith and discipline around the idea of justice?
You know, that's actually a really hard question. I mean, the reason why I study American politics and I study race has to do a lot with mentorship. When I came to college, I thought I was going to go to law school, and I was going to focus on international law because I did Model UN and was continuing to do that in college, and sort of, really was gravitating towards the IR side of the major. But I started working for an African American faculty member who happens to be Kyle's colleague at Duke, who's now the dean of the graduate school there. Who studied race and ethnic politics in the United States, and she took me under her wing. And it was during that period in college where I was thinking about identity and what that meant for me as a Black person. Mm-hmm. If you went to my church and you asked people in the 90s sort of like what their political persuasions were, despite the fact that people were personally conservative, many people would have identified as Democrats because they were Black. That's not something that I would have completely understood until I started to study this and understand why that happened. But I certainly picked up a lot from just general Christian culture and televangelism that Christians were supposed to be Republicans. And so when I got to college and sort of realized sort of, what the pros and cons of those things were, it actually prompted me to think critically about my identity as a Black person and what that meant as a Christian as well. And so it certainly took struggle. And academic study was one of the ways that I think I sort of really reconciled and really helped to formulate my identity about who I was, and even tried to figure out how that, balanced with my identity as a Christian. I remember having friends, one friend in particular, who tried to tell me that my identity as a Christian kind of came first. And I think probably if we were going to put this on a hierarchy, his version of it would have been my identity as a Christian would be here, and then my identity as a Black person would be way down here. And my lived experience said, yes, my identity in Christ is up here, and that's most important above all else. But I live here in America in this body and in this skin, so my Black identity is like right here.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Interact with each other. Yeah. And they determine sort of like, how I even live and move as I'm moving through this American church. Those kinds of debates were things that I was thinking about in college, and academics was a nice way for me to process, to kind of sometimes step back, but also sometimes be able to step in and apply. So I think it kind of happened naturally by osmosis. When I started to think about the questions that I was asking, in graduate school, the things that I thought I would be studying and writing my dissertation about, I didn't think about them necessarily from a Christian perspective. I just thought about sort of the stuff that was most interesting to me, and my faith kind of came to bear in terms of how I conducted myself.
Mm-hmm.
how I interacted with my colleagues. Graduate school, at least for the first couple of years, is a residential experience, right? So you're living and breathing amongst people. And this was my first kind of real adult experience outside of college, of having to go to a new place, live by myself, like live out my faith without necessarily my parents being around, my mom in particular, kind of being around to tell me things. And even sort of the comforts of the undergraduate chapter, because undergraduate chapters look really different from grad chapters. So though I was involved in my grad chapter, right, yet it's not as all consuming as being involved in an undergraduate chapter is, right? You don't have people holding you accountable in the same way. So you kind of have to make steps and and take a lot of initiative in order to make sure that you're still going to follow Christ. So that was kind of where it came through. So it's only been recently that I actually explicitly study religion, and where I know that my perspective, as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as a person of faith, kind of informs the types of questions that I'll ask, and sometimes the perspective, because sometimes I bring a little bit of insider knowledge to that. And not that I don't value what my colleagues who are outsiders bring to some of those questions, but there are things that I probably know to ask better because I literally just heard it in church last week when I'm thinking about it from a social science perspective. And they don't always have access to that knowledge unless they were doing some type of ethnographic thing where they happen to be at the same service that I was.
That makes sense. Kyle, what about you, especially in thinking in terms of your perspective, your upbringing, the personality and the study that you bring to the field?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear Andra share her journey, because I would say that it was somewhat similar to me, that my interest in justice came in a sense sort of after the fact. I mean, it was something that has been motivating me, but I didn't really realize it until I was already well on my way of studying things like international politics and political violence. You asked a question about, is there something that really catalyzed the interest in justice? And for me, it was what catalyzed the awareness that I'm interested in justice was a small group, actually in Atlanta, small group Bible study. Well, and then we were reading some Christian literature, and someone had suggested that we read Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness. Desmond Tutu being one of the important leaders that helped South Africa transition from a apartheid regime to a democratic government led by a Black African majority. And Tutu really ended up being the energy behind having truth and reconciliation, which basically ended up keeping civil war from happening in South Africa as you had this change in power. Seeing him as both a person of faith, as well as someone with just tremendous leadership courage, and just amazing ideas to sort of imagine what life would look like under a new system of rules, and one where justice could actually be served. That was resonating with what I was studying at the time, which was studying violence and the subjugation of some people by other people. And I hadn't really thought about why I was really interested in studying conflict and peace and conflict resolution, until I was able to, sort of see what Tutu was up to in transitioning South Africa as a story of justice and redemption, where violence had been done in the name of injustice, and then through justice, there was the ability to imagine a society where it's going to be more peaceful coexistence. I'll say one more thing that relates to maybe some of my conceptions of justice, which has to do with some of the upbringing growing up in the church. So we had gone to a PCA church, a Presbyterian Church in America church growing up. And maybe many of your viewers will know that that's a denomination that doesn't allow women to serve in leadership. And I have very many dear friends that are followers of Christ at PCA churches. And so I'm not trying to make a statement against PCA. But at the same time that I was growing up in that church, my mother, who's just a really strong personality, she's also an academic, I didn't realize it until after the fact that she was pushing in appropriate ways for more of her voice in the church and more of the voice of other amazing women in the congregation. And I didn't get a glimpse of that until afterwards. But I now realize that I had been raised by a woman who also is following Jesus. Also had a concern for justice, especially with regard to issues related to gender equality. And I think she really carried that out well. Again, being able to advocate for more voice as she felt appropriate, but yet still not letting that lead to rupture of relationship, to try to keep things in balance, that she can walk along people that maybe have different beliefs than her in terms of social arrangements, but yet still be on the same path of pursuing Christ.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, because I think that is part of why we're doing these dialogues, right? Is to find a way to walk alongside others, to see their perspective, to better understand how they fit into the kingdom and how we fit into the kingdom. It's interesting that you mentioned that idea of being able to not necessarily agree with someone, but to understand their perspective. And I think when it comes to issues of political science, right, we're recording this shortly after the insurrection, the inauguration, the impeachment, all of these things that start with I. And I love the fact that when we are able to agree with people on matters of less importance, that then we can plant our feet in the sand and say, but here is the line, right? The line is someone who is actively seeking to demolish peace, actively seeking to bring destruction and chaos. We don't stand with them. But those who are seeing things from a different perspective, whether it's gender issues or even to some extent issues of ethnicity, or any of these other things that can be such hot topics, we can walk alongside them as long as we both understand that we are still serving the same God, we are still seeking after the same peace and joy. And, it's interesting, Kyle, because we are still in a PCA church. And so I appreciate so much this mentorship that your mom now has in my life, of just affirming that a woman can be in those very conservative spaces, but really fight for, not against people, but fight for women's voices to be heard, and for women such as Andra, which is my segue back, women such as Andra to teach and to preach and to share and to be a part of this justice conversation. Andra, do you have any thoughts in response to how Kyle has so graciously brought the issue of gender back into the issue of justice? Because we know that intersectionality means that you and I experience the world differently due to our gender and our ethnicity. Anything you'd like to put back in the context of your journey, or even as you're determining what justice means to you?
This is really tough because we're confronting an American church that, particularly amongst whites who are in the church, is kind of doubling down on recalcitrance in ways that's actually really, really troubling. Yeah. And actually playing the victim card and accepting martyrdom for things that sometimes people deserve to be castigated for. And not actually sort of coming with humility and acknowledging sort of things that have been done wrong. I mean, one of the things that I have to admit that I'm not shocked by, but that I'm very frustrated by, are demands for forgiveness and reconciliation without actually confession. I'm like, wow, you can't go to God and not confess what you've done wrong, but yet we're supposed to go do this this thing now. And I think that that's the part that's really that's really frustrating about this. And understanding like when it's okay to agree to disagree versus when certain positions are actually just being held in error because they're based on things that are factually incorrect, or in places where people assume authority to be able to speak for and about some people, but have no basis on which to make that. So especially when people of color or women of color are telling you situations from their lived experience that people in more privileged positions don't have any basis of knowing anything about, right? And that are, existential sometimes. They get dismissed offhand because people just don't want to do what they want to do. And they don't want to acknowledge that, right, this is only coming from a place of selfishness.
Right.
That's the part that's really difficult. And I think, we are still required by God to love and to forgive. But like, it's hard. And I will admit that that's actually a really hard thing to do right now, especially when things seem so obvious and it doesn't look like, everybody is kind of following along. And so, and at the same time, I do want to be sensitive to arguments and discussions about people getting dismissed or automatically being portrayed in ways as though they're bigots. Like, and so some of the time, about 90% of the time, I'm like, yeah, but you are kind of being a bigot. And I kind of even know that.
Yeah.
But on the same time, when we talk about sort of things about principled dissent, about especially things like tactics and strategy or about personal decisions, right? Like, I don't know if there's enough like grace on either side. Some people telling you, no, seriously, people of color are dying more of COVID. So we might want to rethink sort of our vaccine redistribution sort of strategy. And you're going to sit and argue about that and try to, take selfishness and code it in something that looks like a patina of whatever it is that I can't think of right now. And then justify what it is that you're going to do. Just understand, I love you as a sister in Christ, but I'm going to fight you on that tooth and nail. Yep. And I pray I don't call you stupid to your face, but for forgiveness if I do. But understand like why that's getting heated and why in that situation you look really bad. Right. And I can't sugarcoat that for you, and understand that if people don't always want to deal with you, that no, that's because of you. It has nothing to do with your being persecuted for Christ's sake.
Yeah, that's a good word. All of that. And that's poetry, right? That's pure poetry. Like coding it in a patina of self-righteousness. That's good stuff. What about you, Kyle? What does justice mean to you in terms of this thing you're pursuing? But sometimes we get so busy pursuing it, we forget what it means. And so to get back to the core of what it is.
The two words that come to mind when I think of justice are fairness and accountability. And so in political science, political theory, a lot of theories of justice go to a Rawlsian, John Rawls definition of justice, which sees justice as fairness, where we sort of imagine that if we could just kind of strip out our own sort of personal selfishness or our own, how we would be affected by a certain policy specifically, and just kind of ask, well, what is fair? That is a way that we would see justice being done. Of course, it's not really practical, but it's sort of how we think about that theoretically. I also think about accountability as a part of justice, and this has some biblical roots in thinking about sort of right relationship with God as being something that is good, also just, and that we see injustice being done when people aren't being held accountable. Going back to what Andra was just saying about kind of playing the victim and getting caught up in your own self-righteousness, I find that, and Andra also used the word privilege, right? Those all go together in terms of sort of not recognizing areas where me as the individual, or maybe the collective, right? Some of the collectives that might belong in, whether it's my family or my peer groups or whatever, how in a sense, I've had different standards of accountability that have been applied to me than to others. And we could say that that's not fair. And we would say that would also, in a sense, also not be just. And so when I've sort of taken stock of my own responsibility in systems of injustice that are around us, it often does come down to privilege, and specifically privilege in thinking about how there are different standards of accountability that have been applied. I think back to when I was a youth, young teenager, and I had been caught shoplifting from a 7-Eleven, and I was treated much differently than someone that would have certainly a Black youth at the time, but also someone that maybe didn't grow up in upper middle class society. And I can see that as clear as day, and recognize that as injustice. Recognize about how there have been different systems of accountability, and and then to own that, right? To own that, okay, so given the, in a sense, the freedoms that I have because of different systems of accountability, just try to imagine how it is that I could actually help, rectify, help make sure that we are going to be applying systems of accountability equally. We are going to be pursuing things in names of fairness, to the extent that less accountability leads to more power. Then how am I actually going to use the power that I have to be able to do right, to do justice, rather than to further entrench some of these systems?
It's really good. Thank you. And I think it definitely, when we look at that issue of privilege and what it looks like to steward it, that raises issues of rest and issues of, as you said, drawing near to God. So Kyle, would you share with us what might seem as a bit of a less left swerve, but would you share with us in this idea of you are trying to steward your privilege, trying to be held accountable and hold yourself accountable, how you rest, how you draw near to the great judge, the great God of justice who is just, what you do to, as you're wrestling with these heady questions and these deep issues and these historical horrifying issues of injustice, examples of injustice, how you pursue rest, how do you recharge?
Yeah, so I would say I'll take the super practical, which is that I try most days to do some form of a daily examine, and that's often part of my daily prayer. A former pastor of mine helped me sort of understand how we can take the Lord's Prayer and sort of turn it into kind of a daily examine. So sort of just begin by just submitting ourselves to a good and all-powerful God, right? Our Father who art in heaven. So just believing that there is a force of justice in this universe and that we're subject to them, that will be done on earth as it is in heaven. As I'm praying that, I'm sort of thinking about who and what do I want to see God's will and God's justice being done, especially to bring up those that are experiencing injustice or that are suffering in some way. And then I get into thankfulness, forgive us this day our daily bread. I sort of turn that into a thankfulness, just really appreciating the privileges that I do have, whether it is food or whether it's shelter, or whether it's success. That's something that I'm celebrating. Then I turn into forgiveness, right? Asking for forgiveness for myself, and just really, again, going through my day. I'm usually doing this at night. What were ways in which I misstepped, where I might have been part of the problem rather than part of the solution? But then asking to forgive others. So allowing myself to forgive ways in which I might have seen injustice in that day, and then to think about how forgiveness might enter into that. And then, of course, closing by just recognizing that I need God's help and doing better and keeping away from the temptations. And again, then resubmitting to God's power. I find that as really important to sort of understand ways that I've messed up, but then also doing so in a way that is hopefully conducive to change, right? It's not just, oh, I did wrong, hope I do better next time, but it's actually
right.
Truly repentant, right? And trying to change direction to go towards a new direction.
It's really good. And that's really helpful, that centering practice. And so I love that idea of something that's simple in the midst of chaos, doing a daily examine, praying the Lord's Prayer with intentionality. I think that's really helpful. Andra, what about you? How are you pursuing rest in this season, as well as just in your overall career?
So I'm not perfect at it, but I do actually agree that maintaining spiritual disciplines is really important. So it's very important to make sure, that I open up God's word. In fact, I think, a lot of issues that are being exposed in the church that I don't think everybody's quite aware are being exposed in the church really come back to, I think, two things. I think a lack of understanding of the word. So I think that, there are a lot of people who profess to be Christians who are frankly biblically illiterate, and we've got to do better on that. And then there's also sort of a problem with obedience, and sort of making sure that we're approaching things. And this is hard, right? Because God tells you to do stuff you don't want to do. right? Be nice to that colleague who's terrible to you. And it's not really about them. It's about, well, God told me to do this. And if I want to maintain my relationship with God and keep those lines of communication open, I've got to submit to that. I can't do what I want to do. I mean, and like, that's the ultimate kind of countercultural kind of, position and posture to be in, that I do things not because they are convenient or not because they are popular, but because I truly believe that God called me to do it. Right. And I think a lot of people sometimes think that they're being countercultural because they're going up against people that they don't like, but they're not actually doing it in a spirit of obedience, because there are these huge, big things that are going on off on the side in their lives that they have no intention of ever ceding to God. And I think that there are people who, are carnal, who are, just doing what they feel like doing. And it's because that's what they want to do and not necessarily what God told them to do. And, it could be in the ways that Christians often think about carnality, but it's also usually in other things. And so right now I happen to be reading in the books of prophecy in the Old Testament. And it's just really sobering to read sort of kind of, about the fall of ancient Israel and Judah, and to look at the things that God was calling them to task on, that seem very, very applicable to today's moment as well, right? People care about themselves. They care about pleasure. You have preachers who are basically in it for themselves, and they don't care about their congregations. Like, there's just all kinds of things that are very, very convicting there. And we have to know that. Because it certainly helps to put your ego in check. And I think we need a lot of that in this particular moment. And so if you're not opening your word every day, then you can't have, like, it can't sink in, right? And it can't lead you and it can't guide you, right? We can't go on warm fuzzies and feelings, right? You have to be based in the word. So I think that it's difficult to do, but it's something that is very important, along with cultivating, other types of spiritual disciplines, like praying, like fasting when one is called to it, like being a part of a congregation. So even in a virtual space during the pandemic, it's really important to make sure that, you are maintaining those types of connections, and that one's holding themselves accountable for making sure that they're still continuing to do all of those things to maintain their relationship with God. And I think also sort of culturally in the United States, sometimes understanding some history, like, it's only until recently, that's in part because I have good faculty scholar friends who can tell me this kind of stuff. I think, we think, oh, all of these movements in the United States, the Christian movements, are like based in the Bible. And it's like, yeah, do you know how like important Norman Vincent Peale was to helping to like frame a Christian mindset in the United States? It's like, why are we listening to like a person and the power of positive thinking, as opposed to like looking at the word, which can tell you some of that stuff, but it's not going to tell it to you in a consumerist kind of way. Like, and we have to be really self-aware of that and be willing to challenge ourselves about that. And even, it's not just challenge ourselves to not think that way, but also challenge ourselves to think about, like, what does that look like practically speaking? Right? Like, do I need to pray for that bigger house? Do you need a bigger house? No, then that's not something that you should necessarily be praying for or believing God about, when God might be leading you in a different direction.
That's really good. That's really helpful. I am going to put my campus minister hat back on, just like I used to do in our old Emory days when we would get together for prayer, and you would say, okay, let's pray for the fellowship. And how can I pray for you? And I would say, yes. How can I pray for you? And are you getting rest? So I'm going to push you a little bit further. How are each of you pursuing rest in a very embodied sense, right? Because it's not a matter of, do you have a hobby, which is important, but how are you, as you're pursuing these very important spiritual disciplines, how do you find a way to rest your body and your mind as you're kind of following the way of Jesus?
I'll say two things. So I'll say it's important to have clear boundaries. And then also, I think it's important to treat the mind and body as related. And so specifically things related to exercise and sleep, I think are really important. And so in terms of boundaries, trying to have boundaries of when I'm going to be engaging with social media or even just news media, and when I'm not, when I'm going to be focused on other things, when I'm going to be focused on my work, when I'm not going to be focused on my work, when I'm going to be having time just to really invest in family relationships and friendships. I think just really, really important that that I'm keeping a healthy balance of activities, so I'm not completely overwhelmed. And also with regard to the consumption of media, just realizing that it is garbage in and garbage out, and there's good biblical foundation for that. And so that when I am filling myself with things, that I'm filling myself with writers that are maybe contributing to a diversity of perspectives. It's not just things that I already agree with, but it's a diversity of perspectives, as well as writers that are pursuing good things, whether it is justice or it could be beauty, but something that's going to be life-giving rather than life-sucking. And then with regard to exercise and sleep, just trying to make sure that, as I think across a given week, making sure that I have enough exercise and I have enough sleep. And if not, then make sure that I schedule those in.
That's great.
So I'm not going to put myself up as a role model because I suck and I fail at this like on a regular basis. One of the things I struggle with, especially, and I realized I did it to my students this semester too, was, in trying to make sure that I have a Sabbath. So sometimes my Sabbath actually by default sometimes ends up being Saturday because there are like Saturdays, mini Saturdays. Last Saturday where I was just like catatonic. I couldn't really move. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to like roll with this today, even though I knew I had tons of things. I had, a ton of work to do. But I think it's really important to allow oneself to have a Sabbath. So, we may not feel sort of as New Testament Christians that we're obligated to do that in the same way that Jewish folks feel compelled to by the Old Testament, but there's just a good principle of being able to take a day off. And I still, sometimes feel guilty about it and, still like, work might creep in on Sunday afternoons and other kinds of things, but to allow oneself the ability to be able to do that and to kind of like tune things out. So even though like on Sundays, especially now more that I'm home, I have to just for public scholarship reasons kind of keep up with what's going on. So I have to watch Sunday morning talk shows, but there are points at which like where it's like, okay, I'm cutting the TV off. I probably have something that's like, being paused on my DVR so I can go back to it. But it's like, this is the time that I'm watching church right now. So here is where I'm going to, and I'm going to cut everything out. And this is the time where I'm going to be focused on sort of like making sure that I am spiritually fed. This election cycle was nuts. I remember one time starting church and somebody called me and I was like, seriously, you're calling me on Sunday, like at 11 o'clock. What is wrong with you? But I would do the same thing sort of if we were going like physically going to regular church, right? Like there is a point at which like I don't respond to text messages, right? And if you are texting me like at 11:30 on Sunday morning, then I'm probably thinking that you're not in church. I mean, maybe I know that already. Maybe you went to the early service, but yeah, like there are like, that time between like, 11 and 12:30 is like, yeah, I'm MIA, right? Because I'm not like, even if my phone goes off, I'm not paying attention to it. And I think it's important to be able to carve out that time and to give oneself permission to be able to do this. It's hard in quarantine, especially for somebody who's single where I don't have the same types of family demands. So like I can be working any time of the day and sometimes do because I'm not always being the most efficient. But also just, like I just physically can't stay up like as much as I try to tell myself that. And so part of it is just and I'm still getting to know kind of like my body and going, yeah, that bright idea that I'm gonna get up at 5 o'clock and I'm gonna do some work like that never works out because even if I start, like I'm gonna want to take a nap at like 10:30. Or like it is insane for me to think that I'm really gonna get anything done past 10 p.m. Right. Like, and it just allowed myself to say, yeah, okay, if I'm going to veg out right now, this is the time I'm going to veg out. And like, and it's okay to do that.
Yeah, that's really good to give ourselves permission to follow the mandate that was given, not us for it, but the Sabbath was given to us. To really listen to our bodies and to follow what they need and to not push them to the side while we're doing this important mental work. So thank you both for letting me go campus minister on you, just like I used to when we would have lunch in the Duck long ago days.
In the academic world, it's I'm a big fan of treating Sunday as the first day of the week and Saturday as the last day of the week, and so doing a Saturday Sabbath. I need to, in a sense, be doing work Sunday night, just so that Monday morning is not so overwhelming. Right. And oftentimes if I'm teaching on Monday, I'm prepping Sunday night, which means keeping Saturday as a day of rest, reflection, and again, keeping those boundaries. It makes sense, I think, within an academic, and even for students, right? Some of your students, right? Monday could be super stressful for them. Sunday, I remember as a student, was always a really important day to prep for the week. But that means maybe being a little bit more intentional on Saturday of using that for rest and recreation.
That's really good. Well, as we're wrapping up, I would love to hear from both of you, either of you, as you're thinking about, you've done such a good job of framing this around the word, around the ways that God reveals himself to us, the ways that he has relationship and communes with us. I'd love to hear if you have any advice, if you have any, you've already mentioned some mentors, which I think is really powerful. Would you share with us some advice that maybe was given to you by one of your mentors or heroes that you would want to pass on to the next generation in terms of pursuing justice, in terms of not burning out, in terms of seeking God's face in the midst of what is often chaos in this broken world?
I think I would say that Christians were designed to live in community. And so it's harder right now just because we can't physically be in each other's presence. But it's really important for you to seek out community and to not isolate yourself, particularly in an academic space. Find ways to find other believers who can support you. You may find that they could actually help you with your work too. It's important just for the health of your faith to be known and to involve yourself in a community. So, I would definitely take advantage of your church community, but I would also take advantage of the fellowship community that groups like InterVarsity create to allow Christian faculty and graduate students to get together. You need the accountability. And I think you need to be known. So, if you care about your faith and about maintaining it, right, you're never going to be able to do that in isolation. God called us to gather together. And this is one of the ways that you can gather together. And it's how you can stay strong and how you can stay encouraged.
Yes, I guess I would add that it's really important to develop a practice of listening, not just passively and not as an excuse to not do anything, but to actually listen as an act of hospitality. So one of my colleagues here at Duke in the Divinity School is Luke Bretherton, and he's got a book about basically how we can think about things like hospitality as a political expression, and often actually in hospitality, especially if it's a person that doesn't have power, that is hosting the person with power, in that act of hosting and giving hospitality, you're actually flipping the script, you're actually flipping the power dynamics. And it can be a political expression, but it's really important to be a good listener as we're being hospitable. And so I think developing, the restraint of saying something in response just because you think you should be saying something, or maybe because you disagree with what someone's saying, but actually to take the moment and to listen. In the academic spaces, one of the ways that both gender and racial inequities are really manifested, not the only way, but one of the ways, is in how we listen to each other. So too many stories of people of color and women being spoken over in the classroom, students not listening to the guidance that the instructor, who may be a woman or a person of color, or both, is saying, and not citing the work of women and scholars of color. Right, all that's because, right, those of us that in a sense, again, maybe have had sort of different systems of accountability, right? We've kind of maybe willfully ignored certain voices in the academic spaces. Being able to be a good listener, I think, is a really important first step to then being able to learn from just the beautiful, diverse voices that there are out there, and the diverse sources of expertise that there are. But then also then gives the entire community the ability to then amplify, right? So to the extent that someone that might tend not to be well listened to does have an important thing to say, then if we are being good listeners, then we can turn around and we can amplify through our various channels. And I think, you know, it sounds really intangible, and it is, but I think it's also a really important way in which academic spaces can be transformed towards one that's going to be more just, more fair, and more equitable.
Thank you so much. That's such an encouragement from both of you. Thank you again for being with us. I know that there will be students and faculty and staff who will watch this and who will be very encouraged in the ways in which you have listened to each other, in the ways in which you have spoken up for each other, in the ways in which you have shared your experiences. So thank you so much. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Chandra, it was really a pleasure. Thank you for hosting this. And Andra, it's always great to be in the same space as you, even if we're virtual.
I wish your office was still down the hall for me.
I know. I definitely miss being able to share that space with you. I look forward to the next time that we can actually be physically present.
Yep, me too.
Amen. Thank you for joining us for this Justice Dialogue session with Dr. Kyle Beardsley and Dr. Andra Gillespie. Thank you to Andra and Kyle, as well as my coworker, Glenn Griffin, and his Creative Labs team for producing and editing. I hope this conversation has encouraged you to pursue God's shalom justice in your own field of study and be comforted in knowing that God cares for us in both his justice and his grace.